Tell me that you love me when I'm about to walk away. You say what I'm feeling is true. You say I'm your only one.
So.
Sorry.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. A little thumbs up from somebody I can see. Yes, I can see. Perfect. Thank you so much. My name is Andy Reynolds. I'm a professor at Princeton University in New Jersey, the United States. And this is the Queer Politics webinar, as well you know. We had a week off last week. We're going to reschedule Hannah Bardell, who's the Scottish National MP for Livingston, for a later date. And today we're going to return to our first love of academic scholarship and high-level intellectual investigations of the world of LGBTQ politics. We're very excited to have with us today Christopher Pepin-Neff, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney in public policy and in government and international relations. But I believe and I understand and I project that he is actually an American, not an Australian. Tell us more about that. Actually, interestingly, Chris published a paper last year re-evaluating and reevaluating feared predators, which I thought was a harsh comment on some of our community, but until I realized that it was actually about sharks, because Chris has a hybrid polymath expertise, not just in LGBTQ politics and foreign politics, but also in the relationship between sharks and politics and social constructions of fear and mobilization around these wonderful animals that we find swimming around us. So a very interesting hybrid talent base that he brings with us today. We do our standard roughly 30 minutes of presentation and then take questions. Feel free to send me a message on chat if you'd like to be on the question list. If you want to raise your hand within the chat mechanism within the Zoom as well, I can put you down that way. And today, Chris is going to talk to us about the construction of social capital in LGBTQ communities, which is work based with his co-author, Alexander Webb. Obviously, there is a crucial and important role for the spaces where the queer community has historically met together in social arenas, not just political arenas. And this work is a really fascinating lens into the landscape of bars, of clubs, of media that speaks and caters for the LGBTQ community. So I think as those institutions are slipping away, some of the spaces are closing up, this is fascinating to see how that will affect the mobilization of the LGBT community. So I'm going to hand it over to Christopher, who will lead us through some of his research and entertain us as well.
Hi, Andy. Hi, everybody. How you doing? We had, I was super impressed. Everybody can hear me. That's all right. I was super impressed by Gabe and Chris's presentations earlier, and so I said to Andy, I said, oh, I want to get on board. I won't be as good as them, but I study sharks as well. So if Andy could plug that. And just for the record, I did publish in Politics and Gender last year as well, looking at a study of LGBTQ activists in Australia, South Africa, the US, and the UK. So I'm capable. I might not be the best at it, but I'm capable. Okay, so housekeeping. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am in Vermont at the moment on stolen Abenaki land. Never ceded. And the headline, if you're going to remember anything from this talk, is sex clubs and social capital. So I want to look at the 4 elements of the literature that look at social capital. At the end, Alex and I are going to add to that, but I want to talk about how social capital is construed in political science and economics, and then how that applies to the queer and trans community. So I want to just note 4 things. So foundationally, there are 4 authors. It's Hanifin, 1916, Pierre Bourdieu, 1986, Coleman, 88, and Robert Putnam, 1995. And they note 4 aspects of social capital. They note emotional solidarity, which is referred to as fellowship or trust, the role of social networks, which is often talked about as connectedness, and the generative effect of social capital. So this is the 3rd one. And this is the development of civic infrastructures. So you trust one another, you're connected, and then it leads to something, a civic infrastructure. Maybe you form a group, maybe you form a friendship, and something develops out of that. And then the last is sort of the point that Robert Putnam does in his book, Bowling Alone, which is that that social capital impacts resilience. So there are implications to more or less social capital in society. And that is sort of the contributing factor to where we end up in. So I teach public policy. So where it comes into public policy, and you see this a lot around HIV/AIDS, PrEP. So people who have more trust with their groups, more social connectedness, have access to more civic infrastructures, are more likely to be on PrEP. And we know statistically that, 52% of gay, white, cis men are on PrEP, and 26% of Black and brown cis men are on PrEP. So from a social capital point of view, this is killing people. Like, we are denying people an existence on the basis of the trust that we deny them, the social connectedness that's denied them, the civic infrastructure that's denied them. And then you get this resulting degree of weakened resilience in the face of HIV/AIDS, COVID, natural disaster. We could sort of name unemployment, bad housing. I mean, for marginalized community, poverty, like, we could ableism, like, we could go down the list of youth, for older LGBTQ Americans, like, or people internationally, like, for any of these vulnerable categories, mental health, they end up with worse outcomes as a function of social capital's contribution. So this is really, in my opinion, really important to studies of queer and trans politics. Okay, so let's use an example, okay? The Pussy Palace in Toronto is a women's and trans men sex club, or if you want to call it a bathhouse, or if you want to call it a sauna, at Club Toronto. So it's like a designated night that they have there. If you were, I don't know if there's anybody here from Australia. Hi. If you were in Sydney and went to the Red Rattler, like, they'll sometimes have like Club Kooky, which is a really fantastic Radical Fairy-esque event, which is sex positive, and it's not specifically like many queer and trans events, it's not specifically a sex event, but it happens. So at the Pussy Palace, so it's women and trans men, and let's just go down the list, right? So trust. The literature on this is that at bathhouses, saunas, sex clubs, the same is true with sex workers. There can be increased levels of trust among people in those communities, people you're sort of sharing an experience with, than you might even feel with a partner. Like, there is degrees of partner violence or assault or harassment. And so people might exit those relationships or those experiences to go have sex with a sex worker, or to go to a bathhouse, or to go to a sex club. So trust is one variable. Then the second is connectedness, right? So you're a lesbian at a bathhouse in Toronto, you're at the Pussy Palace, and you're all there together. And, it's sort of like, we talk about this with like gay cis men who go on like Atlantis cruises or things like that. And I mean, I can only sort of relate to what it must be like at a lesbian sex club, like, as something relative to that you're in a community, you're all together, same expectations, you're there because you want to be there. So it creates this level of connectedness. The third is civic infrastructure, right? Now, okay, can I use a terrible example for a minute? Is that all right? Because the whole point I wanted to have of this talk is to highlight lesbians and trans men who were erased from the literature. But the example is a terrible cis white male example. Golf courses, right? It is high level of trust, high level of connectedness. And then for a generative effect, like you go to a golf course to conduct business, right? Like that's where that might be where you go. Like your boss takes you out to go golfing, to offer you a job, or you join people for lunch. And so this is what I mean by a generative effect. So if let's move back to lesbians and trans men at the Pussy Palace. Like maybe you get a job, or maybe you meet a friend, or maybe you start a support group, or maybe you start a swingers club, or polyamorous relationship, or whatever it is. Like there is a generative effect of a civic infrastructure. Maybe you Stonewall was a hustler club. Like it was a club for hustlers. It's not, there's sort of two stories about Stonewall that don't get talked about, right? It's a story of police violence and a story of sex workers. That's what it was. And then the third is sex workers of color, trans and women of color. Like, so, and I can think there was another sex club I was thinking of where it's sort of within our community, these are creating civic infrastructure. So out of Stonewall is the whole queer and trans rights movement, or specifically queer movement. So there's this generative civic infrastructure event. And then the last is resilience. And it was that point that I made about better HIV. Like, so the statistics on, let me just look at it to make sure I don't get it right. So it's better employment, better housing. Here it is. Voting. So for all of the political scientists on here, if you have better social capital, more trust, more social connectedness, you are more likely to vote. You are more likely to have a job. You are more likely to have housing. You're more likely to have better education. You are more likely to have healthcare. You are more likely to have a lower suicide rate. You are, like I said, better access to PrEP, better HIV prevention, and more improved wellness. Other than that, social capital doesn't matter. So when we talk about, like, it was one of the examples which we all know about, right, is having either a supportive family, or like for 16-year-olds, let's use 16-year-old trans woman. If she has more support within her family or within her selected family, right? Her friends and maybe some mentors or teachers or whatever it is, she is more likely to have better well-being and less likely to attempt suicide for a population that is vastly more likely to attempt suicide. So this degree of social capital, the embedded trust and connectedness, the fellowship, and it increases that personal resilience that makes all the difference. Okay, let me see, where am I doing on time? 1:17, am I doing okay, Andy? So I wanted to note a few things, right? So, I need to move on, but I'll just note this. Social capital is a function of power in the redistribution of power. Social capital matters not only because there are implications for marginalized communities, but also because it enshrines privilege, right? The golf course, like they were allowed to exclude Black people till 20 years ago. Like it's an incredibly entrenched system of power. I'll use another example. As we talk about queer and trans bars, specifically gay male cis white gay male cis bars, they're totally ableist. They're also transphobic and sexist and classist. But if I was to think about it primarily, like it is hard, like how many gay, white, cis male bars do I know of with stairs? can you think of one without stairs, to go up, to go down, with a VIP room, with it, any of it? I can think of one, the Oxford Hotel in Sydney, and that has a step. But like, if you can think of any of them, that's assuming they, you know, like how many do you know of where cis women have been kicked out or denied entry, or trans women have been kicked out or denied entry? Like, it's like a thing. Okay. Okay, can we get to the data? Can I share my screen here, Andy? I don't know how to do it.
Yeah, you should be able to just share your screen on
Oh,
your.
I see. There it is. Okay. Okay, everybody, bear with me just for a second. Did that work? Can you see it?
Not yet.
Not yet. I didn't just hang up. Can you see it now?
Nope.
Okay. Okay, please hold. I'm hitting it. Share. Okay.
Perfect.
Hi, that was my practice. Okay. So I want to show this. Can everyone see this?
Yes, we can see.
So this is a measure. So Alex and I looked at 451 articles, and so we put this out for review, but we're still collecting data. Between 2008 and 2019, so 451 articles, 252 articles were about queer and trans venues that had closed. 199 were opens. So in 43 states in DC, and we used sort of basic search terms in LexisNexis, ProQuest, and then we tried to wrap it up with just doing double checked it with online searches. And remember, again, we are not looking at the total number of bars that have closed in that period. We are only looking at a narrow snapshot of the venues and organizations and media that were reported in newspapers, right, or blogs. So that's important. We are going to cross-reference with, like, there's some excellent work that Eric is doing with the Demeron Guide, and there are some other Demeron Guide analyses that are out there. For this one, we wanted something that was a little bit broader, and so the methodology needed to be a little crappier. Okay, so here's what we found. Of the total reports of closing, 63% were bars. Now, again, I'm just going to pause here. We are looking at an analysis of media as well. It could just be so maybe this number could be totally wrong. Like, all we can do is report on the data. What it could be is that media is more likely to report on the closing of bars than they were on the opening of bars or on anything else. So again, it's a narrow question, but this is what the data says. So 63% were bars. 10% of the reporting for things that were open were bars. 7.5% of all of the reported closings were bookstores. 1.5% were of all openings were bookstores. Interestingly, there was more stories on media opening than media closing. Also interesting, more national organizations opening than closing, more regional organizations opening than closing. This is sort of like Equality California, which obviously has been around, but maybe One Colorado, or more queer, you know, again, this isn't an example, but Sylvia Rivera Law Project with Dean Spade, like other organizations that have opened that might be smaller regional organizations, not the Ali Forney Center, but other sort of things like that. But regional was code for statewide LGBTQ organization. 8% of youth centers were in community centers. So of reported closings, 8% were them. Only 2% of them were reported as opening. interestingly, I know this has changed with COVID, and we have, this is part of a larger project. So we have, I think, like 5 journal articles coming out of this data, and one of them is specifically on COVID data. But so I know of prides that have closed, but 13% of all openings were prides that opened. And podcasts opened and drag queen story hours opened. Now, there is a question about what do you, well, okay, that's scary. What do you, where'd I go? I lost you guys. Sorry. Stop sharing. There we are. So there is a question about what counts as social capital, right? That's why I started with these 4 things: trust, connectedness, civic infrastructure, and resilience. Because social capital is not a function of concrete, right? It's not about the buildings or the newspapers or the or those things or the sex clubs. It is about what creates trust, connectedness, civic infrastructure, and resilience. So another thing that has sort of popped up that isn't on this list, but we use it in the literature, is kickball, volleyball, dodgeball, very white, very male, very cis activities. Softball might be slightly more diverse. There's a big LGBTQ. Let me pause. There's a big white male cis like ultimate frisbee tournament in Chicago. So there are, so it might not be buildings, it might be these, or book groups or other things. So another example of this is the data on lesbian bars is catastrophic, right? There aren't any, like I think it was 81% of one of the other studies showed that they had declined by 81%. And so, but the literature on lesbian connectedness is higher. And the articles say that that's a function of because they had to be, because lesbian communities need to be more connected because they have less bars to go to, they have less access to this civic infrastructure. So again, it's not the concrete, it's these other things. Okay, I've got 3 minutes. I do have questions for you all if there is any silence, and I'm not expecting any. Okay, I said that. In our analysis, in Alex and my analysis of social capital, we have added political investment as a variable for consideration. So it's not just, the literature on social capital really comes out of economics, and it's a very positivist analysis, and I get it, and it's all helpful. But for some of the power relations elements, like poor healthcare that leads to, so the literature on social capital tends to negate exogenous variables, and I don't agree. So sorry, I just threw my pen. I don't agree. So we are going to look at some political variables to try to account for that. I'm an intersectional feminist. Like, I think sexism is like a legitimate issue in the construction of political identity and in the distribution of political power. Okay. So there's that. And I said the media bias and reporting. Queer people, like when we look at queer and trans relationships, there's not only is there not trust, like that first variable was trust, there is distrust in the state. And like one of the things, I'll close on this, I mentioned that politics and gender article. we asked 1,000 activists in 4 countries who they are most afraid of for anti-LGBTQ responses, like anti-queer and trans responses. And you know what the answer was in all 4 countries? LGBTQ organizations. Number 1, all 4 countries. So if the data was bad, we wouldn't have found it. If the question was bad, we wouldn't have found it. And so when we look at trust with an organization, like there's often like a, maybe HRC or the task force or Lambda Legal or Trans Equality, like, or Stonewall in the UK. Like maybe there's, maybe they are the community and we rally around them and we trust them and they're the generative effect. My data does not support that. So, and then there are other variables like Grindr and the digital experience, and COVID and unemployment. Okay, that's it. That's all I got.
Great, thank you, Chris. I'm going to take the first question, and then I have a couple of people on the list. But please let me know if you'd also like to get on the list for a question or a comment as well. So, Chris, there's lots of things to unpack from this and avenues to go down and explore because it's fascinating. One of the things that I think we recognized in your data was that there's clearly a shift from social spaces, the bars, the clubs, to perhaps more organizational spaces, media and organizations, which you're pointing out aren't necessarily any more trusted or safer spaces for the community to feel, as though they can flourish within. And you talked about how social capital, having community in clubs especially, would increase voting. But did you find, or do you find, or do you expect to find any degree of sort of political mobilization organizing that came out of the clubs, that came out of the bars? When people were going there to socialize, to find community, to have fun, was there also a degree of political networks formed, not just employment, but actually mobilizing politically?
So the data says yes, but only in the 70s and 80s. So like when there was a burgeoning community and people were doing that, like the answer is yes, but there's less, and we didn't do it now. And one of the really interesting questions would be like the Grindr messages that pop up and say register to vote or go somewhere else, or register to vote or something. I think that would be interesting. We haven't done it, but I have read the literature on mobilization around bars and leafleting and things like that. But it is not current.
And actually, I'm going to be really annoying and steal one more question, because it struck me that the impression is not just that bars are closing, but they're also being overrun with straights. Your LGBTQ bar in the Castro or New York or whatever else is no longer a space where LGBTQ people come, but it's actually a trendy new space where hetero identifying people come and take it over. Does this play into the reduction of space as well?
Yes. There's a bar in this is a terrible word. I'm not going to use the word. What's it called? So a wedding party comes in. I don't know the American word. The bride does a bride party in a gay bar.
Mm-hmm.
That called in Australia, it's called something very specific, which is I'm not going to say.
Okay.
Anyway, people know the thing I'm talking about. So you're in a bar anyway, you're in a bar and then 30 members of a bridal party show up, and it changes the nature of the establishment, and it changes the underlying power dynamic, right? Like there is like to be perfectly honest, there's an expectation of attention, which is not the way queer and trans bars work, right? There is a sex club in Melbourne that has banned women and heterosexuals. It's a queer and trans men bar, and they went to court and specifically fought to make that space more restrictive. And the same is true for women's spaces. Like there are lots of, women's. I was kicked out of like inappropriately so. Like I was kicked out of a feminist sort of book group because I'm not a woman, and that's like people are allowed to have women's spaces, and queer men and trans men and women are allowed to have their spaces.
Great, thank you. Okay, Howard, let's take Howard Rosen.
Hi, thanks, Chris. Let me preface by saying I'm not an academic and I'm new to these concept of social capital. But as a way of testing my understanding, if we used it as a lens on Trump rallies, is the fact that they're creating social capital for their attendees a different way of understanding why they're popular and enthusiastic rather than shared ideology?
So there is a thing called negative social capital, which deals with groupthink. And I think that so you create a bubble for yourself and then you sort of circle in the bubble. I should also note that I'm on the Biden LGBT policy committee, so I have a bias in answering this question. But the data says that there is negative groupthink that can be involved with degrees of social capital, and that can be right and left.
Well, we might judge the social capital created there as negative, but the participants might judge it as wonderful social capital that they honor, and that's part of the appeal.
Yes, I think that's true. Well, that's why I say it's right and left, right? So, but according to the literature, anything that produces groupthink is considered negative. And the same would be true I used to live in a gay socialist commune. I wasn't a gay socialist, but I lived in one, and that was very groupthink as well. So that would be negative.
Okay, let's take Lee Badgett. Lee, are you on?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, this is really interesting, Chris. I don't know this literature very well, but I'm curious about something, and I missed the first few minutes of your talk, so I apologize if you said why you didn't really deal with this. But it is like with the Grindr and kind of more internet-based kinds of social capital that are rising. I mean, if you're trying to, so I guess I'm curious about how you see that fitting into this framework, and is there a way to measure that in some way? And I suspect that this is like especially important in other countries, but in the U.S. the internet has definitely worn away some forms, no more gay bookstores anywhere. Mm-hmm. Replace places for people to meet. There's all sorts of ways that there's, like a direct correlation between those types of things that you laid out and things that are available on the web.
So, hey Lee, I love your work. I think I'm coming to, you're doing a webinar either tomorrow or next week. Anyway, I got with Bob Wittick. Anyway, I'm super excited. So to answer your question, there are 3 points I would make. The first is that the literature on Grindr affecting bars, I don't believe the literature, but it says it's overblown. So, and I can send you that, but it says it's overblown. I don't believe it's overblown, but it says it. The second point is that I've looked a lot at the literature on the way Grindr exemplifies the racializing of bodies. And so, like, generally, I see digital spaces, let me pause. I see white male cis spaces as really problematic. And so there are some bars, and we say this in the paper, there are some bars that close, which is good for social capital. Like some bars closing that were racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, that's fine. Like not every bar was a good bar. And like not every bar that opens was a good bar, not every bar that closes was a good bar. So so the first is that there's that. The second is that there's racializing. We are, our analysis was pretty narrow for this paper, but we are looking at the broader implications of a digital shift. So for instance, I would make 2 points. The first is that the data looks like the shift toward a more digital experience is more equalizing. Like it looks like if you got rid of white cis bars, that increased digital platforms, that would be more equalizing. But there's also an increase in, I'd be interested in your thoughts, but there's also an increase in prides, which have a whatever, I mean, and I like Pride, but it has a disproportionate reliance on corporate money. So is it that we're becoming slightly more corporate and slightly more equal? That would be a very interesting position. But, and so the data, again, the small snapshot of data suggests that might be possible.
Great. Let me pose one quick question and then move to Liz Barker. So Chris, one could say, not being devil's advocate, but sort of saying, you know, trying to explain the manifestation of this change, and perhaps saying it's not that bad after all, by saying that this is just a generational shift, in the sense that there was a context in time when those spaces in the 60s, 70s, and 80s were hugely important, when the community was so much more underground. Now you have a significant younger community that perhaps don't need those spaces and socially organize in other ways and in other venues and online and elsewhere, that perhaps this, what you're finding in the atrophy of spaces is just the natural evolution of the way people integrate in society and generations change.
Yeah, I think that's certainly possible. And I mean, it's clearly happened. And if you look at, like, I know Gabe was tweeting about, you know, West Hollywood LGBTQ bars that were closing, and more like bars will pop up. So we looked in our data at, and I didn't mention this, so we're looking at density. So not in how many bars, so in Duluth, Minnesota, right? How many bars closed in Duluth versus New York City? I think in New York City, it was like 30 bars closed and 18 opened. But in Duluth, 1 bar closed and none opened. So there is certainly there is a function that there is just evolution, but but I think that might be more of a city issue than it is a rural issue, because the loss in social capital is so much greater in communities like Duluth.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Let's take Liz Barker.
Thank you very much. That was really, really fascinating. I suppose I want to talk about things from a non-American perspective. We've had a very interesting thing happen a lot this year. We've had 2 or 3 incidents where people there's been attacks on bars, and we've got to the point where, you know, like random attacks on bars by lone people, and we've got to the point where the British media doesn't say that they're gay bars, but we all know. We've kind of moved beyond That one happened in Birmingham just this last week, and I found myself reflecting why that should be. And I don't know whether it is because there is, as Andy was alluding to, we've now got to a point of greater societal general acceptance that we just don't attract such prominence in such a way. But I wondered whether at a further stage you might be able to go back and plot something, not just the demise of sort of gay physical spaces, but the increase in gay parts of non-gay businesses in an area. Do you know, the general acceptance of business towards the LGBT community, and also whether there is a correlation between the existence of gay spaces and voluntary and community organisations, charities. You know, because of the effects of 2008, and now because of COVID, our charitable sector is about to go through a huge process of turmoil. And that was those were different places in which the first of your 4 points, the emotional solidarity and the social networks and all of those happened. So I wondered whether you'd see other traits going along besides the ones that you've spoken to us about.
So I'm going to get to your question. I might ask you to rephrase it a little bit, but for the point about media, so we are going to do a media bias analysis, which sort of goes to your point around why the bar isn't considered a gay bar or a lesbian bar or whatever it is. Our argument is that this is not a function of it being, I mean, the same happened with the Pulse nightclub shooting. It wasn't called a brown bar. That was a Latino bar. They called it a gay bar, not a Latino bar. That was not a white bar, and a club. But so our argument is that it is a function of advertising, of a greater, that who are the advertisers and again, I'd be interested in talking to Lee about this at some point, but our argument is it's a function of advertisers and a function of stereotypes, that gays might sell more or be more attractive to a wider audience than Latino gays. And maybe the same is true for maybe it's not true with the bar, but, or the venue that you were, the bar that you were noting, but it also could be that bars as a storyline, as an editorial storyline, sell more than a gay, you know what I mean? Than a gay storyline. That could be wrong. But that is something that we're looking into. You were asking about charities. I missed that, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Back in the day, gay bars and all that were our meeting points. Mm-hmm. And then we got to a point where we started to get money to set up lots of charities and voluntary organizations, often funded by local government in our case, and central government. We're about to go into a period where the number of charities is going to be in decline. And so that explicit social solidarity, emotional support to the community is going to go through something of a transformation. And I wondered whether you had managed to plot any of that along with the work that you've already done.
We rely on, has everyone here read Meryl Beam's Gay Incorporated, where she talks about the nonprofit industrial complex? It's a very interesting analysis, and basically her point is that there's just that as the money falls away from these things, there's an there's an over reliance on sort of a neoliberal corporate model to pick up the funding. And it seems to me that that is what, I mean, there's only a limited amount of money in the universe. If the government cuts it off, then people will look elsewhere. That's what happened with cities, is what I was referring to earlier. Like cities lost funding for Pride, and Nike and Coca-Cola stepped up. So it sort of balances the thing, for good or for bad. That seems to be the business model.
Thank you.
Great. We have a few minutes left, and I know some people had to leave for their APSA panels. We're up against APSA. But let us take Christopher Barnhart.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Hi. I was just, thank you so much for your presentation, first of all. But I'm wondering, like, what role you think resilience plays in social capital and vice versa.
I think that resilience is probably the most important element of social capital. That when you, I mean, because that's the one, as political scientists, like this is the one that kills people, right? Like trust isn't going to kill people, and social connectedness is like tricky, but like the way we redistribute power away from communities, like food deserts, and I don't know if anyone here is studying food deserts, but like in marginalized communities, like we deprive them of food. We deprive lesbians of social connectedness. We deprive African Americans and Black and brown people of social connectedness, which leads to greater degree, and there's transphobia, which leads to greater amounts of suicidality. So, and resilience is the systematic element. If all of the other ones are sort of, you could build a bar, open a volleyball team, start a blog, you know what I mean? Like if you said, okay, well, we're going to start by building social capital and just do stuff for people, you could do okay. Like you could, again, but remember, social capital is not the concrete, it's the trust. And this issue of resilience needs to be built up over time. And so,
can I ask, do you think that it's possible to build a community resilience? And how do you go about doing that?
Okay, so the closest literature to this is the disaster literature that there's resilience literature in international relations. And basically you build capacity. It's a capacity building argument. So it's not a function necessarily of resilience to COVID. It's capacity to deal with pandemics or whatever it is. So you build capacity. And one of the ways you build capacity is it sort of goes in the reverse. It was the point you made about sort of how does the other one affect the other one? Like making more tight-knit communities, reducing homelessness, giving people somewhere to go. Like you are not resilient if you are homeless and don't have a job. But if you have a family or a chosen family that provides you support, then you are more likely to be resilient. So like, we just don't do this for queer and trans youth. Like we could, we just make a decision not to.
Good. Let me pose one last question to you, Chris. You reported to us the overall data across the US. Was there anything interesting varying by state? Did you see patterns where maybe the South or the West or the Northeast was different? Or were there specific states where the actual closings and openings looked very different to the overall national picture?
I am looking at it. California lost 41 total net. New York lost 32 net. so the biggest were where you would expect them to be. But, you know, these, like Alaska lost its only one. And like, I would vote, like, I think the Indiana lost 2. Now they're at 0. Like, Kentucky lost 2 and they're at 0. Like, so I would sort of that point I was making earlier, that I think what we're going to do, again, I'm sorry, but we'll do it in the next paper, is to compare the losses with the population size, and so it'll be population size, and then it'll be this was the problem. We couldn't get a flatline measure of all of the resources that were in a given state. So all I can tell you is that we lost 2 in Duluth or whatever it was, but I don't know that that is necessarily 0. Like, I don't have an absolute 0 on it, because I can't do 50 states. I don't have the capacity to do 50 states.
Hello, Andy, you have a question?
Oh, thank you. ¿Dónde estaba?
No. Okay. Well, let me just follow up on that very briefly. So, I mean, one hypothesis would be that in the places that were formerly very repressive and the community was so driven underground, that maybe in the Deep South, a little bit of change, a little bit of openness actually might allow for 1 or 2 clubs to open where they never existed before, or at least be visible. Whereas where, you know, I mean, you're seeing a change in the economics in New York, California, you're going to get the big losses there. It doesn't sound like you're really finding that. And also the difference between urban and suburban areas. Maybe all these clubs are just moving to the suburbs. Unlikely, but again, that's a sort of something that might be interesting to look at. All right. Well, thank you everybody for another fabulous seminar. Thank you, Christopher, for presenting this data, which is so unique and important to us. Just before we go, I should let you know that next week we have Andrew Proctor, who is at the University of Minnesota, and he's doing work on the politics of the sexuality and responses to LGBTQ candidates within US parties. So looking at Democrats and Republicans at party conventions and how the party themselves reacts to LGBTQ officials and candidates at the convention level from 1980 to 2012. So that's Andrew Proctor next week. We hope you all stay safe and well, and we will continue this on through the pandemic, through the end of the year. And we're thinking about moving perhaps to every other week in the spring, but continuing on the seminar series through February through May, where we do it twice a month instead of 4 times a month. But thank you all for joining us. Keep well, keep safe, and we'll see you next week. Thank you, Chris.